The morning Cecilia Voss stepped onto the platform at Harrow Creek, the wind came off the plains hard enough to tilt her hat. She caught it with one gloved hand and stood straight while the train wheezed behind her. And she looked at the town the way a woman looks at a thing she has already decided about. Harrow Creek was a cattle town with 2 saloons, a dry goods store, a church that leaned east, and a land office that smelled of pipe smoke and old paper. The dust on the main street was the color of old bone. Cecilia took it in without blinking. She was 23 years old, daughter of Aldous Voss, who ran the Voss Territorial Bank out of Cheyenne, and had opinions about nearly everything. She wore a traveling dress the color of pine needles, her hair pinned under a hat that had cost more than most Harrow Creek families spent in a month. She carried a small leather case and a folded letter from her father that she had not opened in 4 days because she already knew what it said. Behind her, 2 porters wrestled a trunk onto the platform. The trunk was heavy. It always was. She was not here on holiday. She was here because Aldous Voss had called in a debt. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The man who owed the debt was named Garrett Cole. He ran a ranch 4 miles north of Harrow Creek, on a parcel of land that had been in the Cole family since 1871, back when the territory was still learning what it was. The Voss Bank held a note on that land, a note Garrett's father had signed in a bad year, and Garrett had been paying down ever since, steady and without complaint, until the drought 2 summers ago took most of what he had. The note had gone into arrears. Aldous Voss had options. He chose his daughter. The arrangement, as her father laid it out, was simple. Cecilia would go to Harrow Creek as the bank's representative, review the Cole Ranch operations, and deliver a verdict. If the ranch showed sufficient promise, the bank would restructure the debt. If it did not, the land would be filed for recovery by spring. Her father framed it as an opportunity. Cecilia, who knew her father's framing of opportunities, understood it as something more complicated. She had a mind for numbers. Aldous Voss had seen to that, if nothing else. By the time she was 16, she could read a ledger the way other girls read novels. By 20, she had been managing the bank's smaller accounts under her father's supervision. By 22, she had identified a pattern of overextension in 4 of the bank's ranch loans that her father's senior men had missed entirely. He had not thanked her for it. He had given her a harder assignment instead. The liveryman at the depot was a thin fellow with a red nose named Clement, who looked at her trunk and then at her with the same expression, like both were problems he had not been warned about. He took her to the Cole Ranch in a wagon that had seen better decades. The road north was rutted clay. Neither of them spoke much. The land on either side was flat and wide, and golden pale in the October light. The grass gone dry and the sky above it the particular blue that only happened out here. Too much of it, deeper than you expected. She watched it from the wagon seat, and did not find it beautiful, and did not find it ugly. She found it honest in a way that Cheyenne, with its plank facades and its bank marble, sometimes was not. Garrett Cole was in the yard when the wagon pulled up, and she had her first look at him from the wagon seat before he had his first look at her. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, broad through the shoulders with a face that had been in the weather long enough to read its history there. He wore a work shirt the color of old rust, and he had a bridle in his hands that he was mending with the unhurried focus of a man who had more to do than time to do it. He looked up at the sound of the wagon and went still for a moment. His eyes moved from Clement to the trunk to Cecilia, and whatever he had expected, she was not it. She stepped down from the wagon without waiting for help. The yard was dirt and dried mud, and it pulled at her boot heels. She looked at the barn, which was old and gray and missing 2 boards on the south side. She looked at the house, which was 2 stories and weathered to the color of driftwood. She looked at the corral, where 4 horses stood in the October afternoon, and she looked at the sky where 3 crows circled over the north pasture for reasons she could not yet identify. Then she looked at Garrett Cole. He had not moved. He was watching her the way he might watch weather coming in from the west, with the calm attention of a man who understood that weather arrived regardless of his feelings about it. She crossed the yard to him and held out her hand. "Cecilia Voss," she said. "The bank sent me." He shook her hand once, firm and brief. "Garrett Cole," he said. "I know why the bank sent you." He did not say he was glad she had come. She had not expected him to. His ranch hand, a young man named Dix with a sun-weathered face and the watchful eyes of someone who has worked around difficult situations, appeared from the direction of the barn and looked at the trunk, then at her, then at Garrett, and made no comment. There was also a woman who came to the kitchen door and stood there long enough to take stock of the situation and then went back inside. Mrs. Aldine, Garrett said, seeing her notice. She manages the household. A widow. She comes in 3 days a week. Cecilia nodded. She picked up her leather case and followed Garrett inside. The house was plain but not neglected. The floors were swept. The kitchen had dried herbs hanging from the rafters in bunches that had been tied with care. There was a stack of ledger books on the table that Garrett had clearly pulled out in anticipation, and she recognized this as a man who did not intend to play games about where things stood. She sat at the table and opened the top ledger and read while he made coffee on the stove. He set a cup in front of her without asking if she wanted one. She drank it without looking up from the page. The numbers were what she had expected, and also worse. The drought losses were documented honestly, which she noted. Men who were hiding things did not document honestly. The herd had been at 1,100 head before the drought. It was at 340 now. The grazing on the north and east sections had not recovered. The feed costs were high because the grass was poor. The debt to the Voss Bank was not the only debt, though it was the largest. There were 2 smaller notes with a supply merchant in Harrow Creek and one with a neighboring rancher named Pfeiffer who had lent Garrett feed in the bad summer. She turned pages and drank her coffee and said nothing for a long time. Garrett sat across from her and let her work. He did not explain himself, did not apologize, did not try to tell her the numbers were better than they looked. She was beginning to understand something about Garrett Cole, which was that he did not perform for audiences. Whatever he was it plainly. The first night she slept in the upstairs room that Garrett had aired out and put fresh ticking on, and she lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settle around her. It was a different silence than Cheyenne. In Cheyenne there was always something underneath the quiet, the sound of the city working even when the streets were empty, the distant commerce of a place that never fully stopped. Here the silence was complete and it had weight to it, like a thing that belonged to the land rather than the absence of anything. She heard the horses shift in the corral. She heard the wind change direction somewhere around midnight. She lay in the dark and thought about the numbers she had read that afternoon, and about the honest documentation of losses, and about the way Garrett Cole had set a coffee cup in front of her without asking, and about the crows she had seen circling the north pasture and what they had been circling, which she intended to find out in the morning. She spent 2 days going through the books, and then she asked to see the land. Garrett took her out on horseback, which she had not expected him to offer, and which she had accepted without showing that she was pleased. She rode well, not the practiced seat of a show rider, but the practical ease of someone who had spent time in the saddle and was not concerned with appearance. They rode the north pasture first, where the grass was thin and the earth showed through in patches. She could see what the drought had done, and also what the drought had not done. The creek that ran through the eastern section was still running, thin but clear. The soil along its banks was dark and good. She asked about the creek's history, whether it had ever run dry. Garrett said not in his memory, and his memory went back to age 6 when his father had brought him to this land on a wagon from Ohio. He said this without sentiment, just as information, the way a man states a coordinate on a map. She looked at the creek and then at the land rising away from it to the east, where the soil was pale and thin and would need years before it held grass the way it once had. She asked if the original grass cover had been buffalo grass or something else. He said buffalo grass mostly, with blue stem along the creek margins. She asked if any seed stock remained from before the drought. He pointed to a low area on the far side of the north section where the ground was slightly lower and had held moisture longer, and even now you could see the thicker growth that the buffalo grass made when it was healthy. She looked at it for a long time. He waited without asking what she was thinking, which she noticed and which she found she did not mind. She asked about the south pasture. They rode down to it. The grass there was better, not recovered but recovering, and the land had a natural bowl to it that held moisture. She asked about the grazing rotation. He told her what he had been doing and she listened and then said, very briefly, that he was rotating too quickly through the south section and not quickly enough through the north, and that if he gave the north another full season of rest while moving the herd entirely to the south and the creek sections, the north would come back by the following year. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where did you learn pasture management?" She said she had corresponded with an agricultural extension officer in Denver who had worked on rangeland recovery after the previous decade's drought. Garrett looked at the north pasture. He said nothing for a moment. Then, when did you write to him? Last month, she said. When your father told me where I was going. He looked at her for the first time that day, with something other than neutral wariness in his face. She did not point this out. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. On the third evening, she sat at the kitchen table after supper with her own notebook open and a page of numbers that she had worked through twice to be sure of. Garrett was at the other end of the table, mending a piece of harness with the same focused economy she had noticed in him when she arrived. Mrs. Aldine had gone home 2 hours ago. The lamp between them made a warm circle on the table, and outside the October wind moved through the grass with a sound like water over stones. The ranch is viable, she said. He set down the harness. She had been thinking about how to say what she had to say, and had decided the only way to say it was plainly, the way she would have wanted someone to say it to her. The grazing rotation needs to change as I described. The herd cannot go above 500 head until the north pasture recovers, which puts a ceiling on income for the next 2 years. But the creek section is an asset you are not using. There is bottom land along that creek that would support a kitchen garden and a small orchard if someone put the work into it. That is not cattle work. That is household work, and it would cut your operating costs by a margin that matters. She turned the notebook toward him. The numbers are here. He looked at them for a long time. She watched him read. He moved his finger along a row of figures, and she could see him doing the arithmetic internally and arriving where she had arrived. He looked up. You are recommending the bank restructure the note, he said. I am recommending you request the restructuring, she said, and that you submit this pasture plan and a revised herd ceiling as the basis for it. I will write my assessment to my father. He was quiet for a moment. What will your assessment say? That the land is sound and the operator is honest, and the losses were the result of weather and not mismanagement, and that a revised repayment schedule over 7 years, rather than 4, would allow this ranch to function and to grow. He looked at the notebook again. After a moment he said, quietly, why? She looked at him. It is accurate, she said. He said, I mean, why go to the trouble? His voice was careful, not hostile, just genuinely asking. She thought about several answers and gave him the honest one. Because the numbers said so, she said. And because I have seen what my father does with land he forecloses on. He does not farm it. He holds it. And good farming land should be farmed. He was quiet after that. The wind moved through the grass outside. The lamp burned between them. After a while he picked up the harness again and went back to work. And she went back to her notebook. And the kitchen was quiet in a way that had no particular tension in it. She wrote the assessment the following morning and gave it to Garrett to read before she sealed it. He read it at the kitchen table with his coffee, and when he was done, he set it down and looked at it for a moment and said, You did not have to let me see this. She said she thought he had a right to know what was being said about his land. He said, I meant the part at the end. She had written, at the end of the assessment, a single paragraph that was not strictly necessary for the bank's purposes, but that she had included, because it was true, and because she believed true things should be said plainly. The paragraph read, The coal ranch represents the kind of operation that benefits a territory and a community. The operator works without complaint and documents honestly and makes decisions based on the long-term health of the land rather than the short-term recovery of cash. These are not qualities that can be manufactured. They are either present or absent. At Coal Ranch, they are present. Garrett looked at her. She folded the letter and sealed it. She said she would take it to Harrow Creek and post it that afternoon. He said he would drive her. They drove in the wagon in the October afternoon, the plains wide on either side, and the sky doing what it always did out here, offering more of itself than you had asked for. He said, partway to town, Your father sent you because he thought this would be simple. She said, My father sends me where he thinks the outcome is already decided. He said, And when it is not? She looked at the road. I write what I find, she said. He nodded. The town appeared ahead of them, its buildings low against the horizon. She posted the letter at the depot office, and they drove back in the late afternoon light. And neither of them said much, and neither of them needed to. She had planned to leave the following morning. The letter was sent. Her assessment was made. There was no practical reason to stay. She was at the table in the early morning packing her leather case, when she heard Garrett come down the stairs, and she heard him go to the kitchen, and she heard the stove being fed, and she heard the coffee begin. She sat at the table with the leather case half packed, and looked at the window where the early light was coming gray and thin through the glass, and she made a decision that she did not entirely understand and did not try to explain to herself. She went to the kitchen. He was at the stove with his back to her. She sat at the table. He set a cup in front of her without turning around. She said, "The creek section. Have you ever put a kitchen garden in along the south bank?" He said, without turning. "Clara planted one there the first year. My wife." She said, "When did she pass?" 3 years ago." He said, "February. The influenza." He turned with his own cup and sat across from her. He said, "She knew that land the way you know a face. She knew where the water table sat and where the frost came earliest and where the soil had the most depth. She looked at the creek section like other people looked at people." He said it quietly, not with grief exactly, more with the particular plainness of a man saying a fact that is also very large. Cecilia said, "Who manages the household accounts?" He said, "I do." She said, "You have been paying Mrs. Aldine's wages out of the operating account." He said, "Yes." She said, "It should come from the household accounts separately, or your operating numbers will continue to look worse than they are." He looked at her. "You notice that?" he said. She said, "I notice numbers." He said, quietly, "Clara noticed numbers. She was the one who kept the books before the drought. I have not been as careful since." Cecilia looked at her coffee. She said, "You should let someone help you with it." He said, "I am particular about who handles the accounts." She said, "I know." He looked at her over his coffee cup for a moment. Then he said, with the careful flatness of a man who has decided to say a thing and is committing to saying it, "Would you be willing to stay another week?" She said, "Why?" He said, "Because the south pasture rotation needs to be mapped before winter sets in, and I have not had anyone to think through it with since Clara died. And you understand the land and the numbers both, and a week would let us set it up properly." She looked at him. She said, "The bank did not send me for a week." He said, "I am not asking the bank." He looked at her steadily, without performance. She set down her cup. She looked at the window where the morning light was coming cleaner now, the gray going pale gold at the edges. She said, "I will need paper." He said, "I have paper." She said, "And the creek survey, if you have one." He said, "I have that too." She unpacked her leather case. The week became 10 days. She mapped the south pasture rotation with Garrett in the mornings, walking the land with stakes and a survey rope and a notebook that she filled with measurements and calculations and small diagrams of where the fence lines should move. In the afternoons, she sat at the kitchen table with the household accounts and rebuilt them from the ground up, separating the operating costs from the domestic ones, tracking the feed purchases and the veterinary calls, and the supply merchant's invoices with the focused patience of someone who had been doing this since before it was fashionable. Mrs. Aldine came on her 3 days and watched Cecilia at the table and said nothing about it, but she began leaving coffee without being asked, and one afternoon brought a plate of cornbread and set it down and said only, "You should eat." Dix, the ranch hand, stopped looking at Cecilia sideways after the 4th day. On the 5th day, he asked her a direct question about the feed cost comparison she had mentioned, and she answered it, and he nodded and went back to work, and after that treated her as though she had always been there. She had a letter from her father on the 8th day. He had received her assessment. The bank would restructure the note. The new terms would arrive by post within the month. He wrote at the end of the letter, in the particular dry tone he used when he was saying something he did not want to say directly, "I had expected a different recommendation." She read the letter once, and folded it, and put it in her case. On the 9th evening, she and Garrett were at the kitchen table after supper, a pasture map spread between them, and she was explaining a calculation about the creek section's potential yield if the kitchen garden were re-established, and he was listening with the total attention she had come to recognize as the way he listened to things that mattered. She said, "The investment in seeds and soil amendment would return in the 2nd season if the establishment year goes well." He said, "Who would manage it?" She looked at the map. She said, "Someone who knows the land." He said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, plainly, "I am going to say something directly." She looked at him. He said, "I would like you to stay." She said, "The bank does not need me here." He said, "I am not asking the bank." He looked at her with the same steadiness she had seen in him from the first day. Nothing performing, nothing withheld, just a man saying what was true. He said, "You know the land now, and you know the accounts, and you think the way Clara thought, straight at the problem without going around it." He paused. "I am not saying it is the same, I am not saying anything except that this ranch runs better with you in it, and I have noticed that, and I am telling you directly, because I think you prefer that to the other kind." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "My father will not approve." He said, "I am not asking your father." She looked at the map between them. She looked at the creek section she had marked, the south bank where the soil was dark and good, and where the frost came late enough to give a long growing season. She thought about Cheyenne and the bank marble and her father's office, where the decisions about other people's land were made from a comfortable distance. She thought about the north pasture and the way it had looked in the morning light when they rode out, thin and pale and fighting back, which it was doing, slowly and without complaint. She said, "I would want to manage the household accounts properly." He said, "I would want you to." She said, "And the pasture rotation should be reviewed every spring." He said, "Agreed." She said, "I write to my father myself. I do not need you to do it for me." He said, "I would not try." She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, very quietly, "All right." He nodded. He did not say anything else, and neither did she. The lamp burned between them, and outside the October night had gone fully dark, and the wind through the grass made its low sound, and the ranch sat around them the way a place sits when it knows what it is. The letter to her father was 4 pages, and took her 2 evenings to write. She said plainly what had been decided and why, and what she expected from the bank's restructuring terms. And she said at the end, in the same direct tone he had always used with her, and that she had always used back, "I have found a place where the work is real and the land is honest, and the man who runs it does not pretend to be other than he is. I expect you will disagree with this decision. I expect you will say it was not what you intended when you sent me here. What you intended when you sent me here was a foregone conclusion. What I found was a situation that required a clear assessment and then a choice, and I have made both." She sealed the letter and gave it to Clement the liveryman to post, and did not spend time worrying about the response. There would be one. There was always one with her father. But she had been reading her father's intentions for 23 years, and she understood by now that his disapproval had a shape and an end, and that she was capable of sitting with it until it passed. The response from Aldous Voss arrived 3 weeks later. It was brief, which was unusual. It said, "You were sent to assess the property. You have done so. The bank will honor the restructuring terms. If you have made other decisions, those are yours to live with." At the bottom, in smaller and less formal script, as though it had been added after the letter was already folded, the creek section assessment was correct. "I had not thought of the kitchen garden application. You noticed something I missed. This is," he had written, and then stopped, and then started again. "This is not nothing." She read the letter twice, and folded it carefully, and put it in the wooden box on the kitchen shelf, where she had begun keeping things that mattered. Garrett was in the yard when she went out to tell him. He was working on the fence line along the south pasture, moving with the focused mechanical rhythm she had first seen him use the morning she arrived. She walked out to him, and he straightened and looked at her. She said, "The terms are confirmed." He nodded. She said, "And my father acknowledged the creek section analysis." He said, "That is not nothing." She looked at him. She said, "That is exactly what he said." He was quiet for a moment, and then he did something she had not seen him do before, which was smile, small and without performance. The smile of a man who has found something genuinely amusing and is not trying to hide it. She found that she was smiling back. The winter that year came in hard at the end of November, which was early. The creek section did not get its kitchen garden that year. There was too much else to do. But in the spring, when the ground softened and the frost pulled back from the south bank and the creek ran clear and fast with the snowmelt, she put in the first stakes herself on a morning when the air was cold and clean and the sky was doing its particular thing with the light. Garrett came out from the barn and saw her and brought her coffee without being asked and stood beside her looking at the staked-out ground. He said, "Clara would have liked you." She held her coffee and looked at the dark soil along the creek bank. She said, "She sounds like someone worth knowing." He said, "Yes." After a while he said, "What are you planting first?" She said, "Onions." "Practical." He said, "Practical." She looked at him. He looked at her. The creek ran beside them, and the morning light came across the plains from the east in that particular way it had out here, wide and unhurried. And the ranch lay around them in all directions, the north pasture coming back. The south pasture rotated correctly. The herd small and healthy and positioned to grow. The house behind them, with Mrs. Aldine's lamp already burning in the kitchen window. She said, We should get the east fence moved before noon, he said. I know. Neither of them moved for another moment. The light moved across the land and the creek moved through it. And somewhere above the barn a meadowlark started up. One clear line of sound, and then another. She put the coffee cup down in the grass and picked up the next stake and drove it in. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.